Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. My name's Amy, and I work for Leeds City Council as part of the economic development function. And my role involves supporting Leeds Anchor Network. So, just to say a little bit about the network, our network was established in 2018. It's a fairly large place-based anchor network in the city. We've got 13 organisations that are part of it, and they span the local authority, so Leeds City Council, some of the major universities and colleges in the city. We've got all of the city's NHS trusts, and also some cultural organisations, so the Royal Armouries and British Library, and utilities as well, so some of the regional utility firms. So mostly Leeds-based public sector organisations, but also some regional organisations and a couple of national organisations that have a significant presence in Leeds. And the network come together to work on how they can collectively contribute to the ambitions for the city, including having an inclusive economy, developing better health and well-being across the city, and the city's net zero targets. We were lucky enough to secure some funding from the Health Foundation a couple of years ago through their Economies for Healthier Lives programme, which is a programme that's essentially all about how understanding how economic development initiatives influence health in communities. And they're very interested in anchor networks as part of that. And how we wanted to use that funding was to really strengthen the role of the Leeds Anchor Network in addressing health and economic inequalities in Leeds, bearing in mind that most of the organisations that are part of the network, have a really influential role in this already. But what we wanted to do in particular was to look at ways that we could ensure that the network was being informed by community priorities, and that we were strengthening relationships with communities in the city that are facing those highest levels of inequalities, and also, crucially, community organisations working across Leeds. And when we started this work, we were really thinking about where's the best place for some of this to sit, and how do we actually what are the right connections to make there in terms of using our community and third sector to help influence the anchor network. Leeds has a very diverse and broad third sector, and we have a number of different umbrella organisations that represent the sector. And within that, you've obviously got groups that are sort of place-based and also representing communities of interest. But around this time, we had the development of a new network in the city, which was the Leeds Community Anchor Network. And this is a network that formed really in a response to the COVID pandemic and the way that locally rooted organisations had to operate in that emergency situation. And we saw over that period a real kind of dynamic approach and the really kind of strong development of relationships on the ground between local organisations that might not have been necessarily working together before. So the third sector partners in the city decided that this felt like a really important way of working to continue after COVID, and so developed a network of locally rooted community organisations in Leeds that would work together around some shared principles, particularly around collaboration and around elevating community voices. And one of the things that network had aspirations to do and felt really aligned with our ambitions for Leeds Anchor Network was to develop a model of engagement that could be replicated across the city, that was really about listening to communities in a way that works for communities and that makes sense to communities, and being able to share insights from that engagement with sort of influential decision makers in the city. We worked with the Community Anchor Network to pilot a community listening exercise model, and we decided to start in 3 areas of the city, 3 of our priority wards that are areas of Leeds with the highest levels of inequalities and disadvantage, and decided to focus the conversations on community perspectives about accessing quality work and skills. So we could have looked at a number of different areas that relate to anchor activity, but this really made a lot of sense because it's something that is really important to communities and is important in terms of influencing health and economic inequality, but also one of those areas that anchor organisations have significant influence over. And so we worked with those 3 organisations to develop this listening exercise model. And just to tell you a little bit about the methodology that was sort of engaged to do this, there was a 2-stage process, firstly involving a postcard exercise with some really kind of simple questions that were posed to communities And you can see that on the screen there, which is really about understanding people's perspectives of what the opportunities are that are available to them and how their skills could be better used. And for those who are familiar with sort of asset-based and strength-based approaches, there was a lot of care taken to make sure that the questions were framed in an asset-based way. So not asking people about barriers and problems, but asking them about how, what skills they have, what experiences they have, and how, if those skills and experiences were better used, how would that impact their lives? So this was delivered by the local community organisations, by people who knew the communities really well, and they would know which settings to go into to have those conversations with people, and did that in a variety of creative different ways. And then following the postcard kind of quick capturing of opinions process, this then led to some focus groups. So people were invited into focus groups, and the community organisations found that this did help to bring in people who they might not have otherwise engaged with, and some people who were not familiar to them already. And the focus groups really kind of looked at the themes in more detail, and that led to the development of a report which is available online, which really summarised the findings from the engagement. So I won't spend too much time on this because I can share this afterwards in terms of what the findings were. But as you would expect, there were recommendations for anchor organisations that came out of that about how anchors could look at their recruitment processes and do things differently to remove some of the barriers that are experienced by communities. So as you might expect, one of the first things that we did from this was made sure that those findings were presented back into the Anchor Network. So we took it to the executive group, which is all the most senior leaders of the Anchor Network, and also to their employment working group, which is the HR leads across those organisations. But a really key important point for us was that this process would have feedback loops, and that it would lead to the development of new initiatives and new partnerships. So not just listening to communities, but then never feeding anything back again. So the second phase of the work was to bring in representatives from the Anchor Network to work directly with community members to explore what some of the potential solutions could be, and making sure that that was really driven by the things that communities said were important to them. And so this photo shows some of those kind of anchor representatives coming together with community members in one of the areas of the city. And for each of the three areas we looked at, which makes sense for which anchors to involve in those conversations based on the things that we knew were important to those communities and what were some of the kind of main themes of the conversations. So just one example from one of those three areas of what this work has led to. So in New Wortley, which was the photo I showed you on the last slide, anchor partners have been working with the community organisation and members of the local community there to develop a new pre-employment support offer. And this is something that's going to be delivered from the centre, from the community centre, which was one of the sort of things identified by community members as wanting to hear about job and skills opportunities from trusted local networks, and wanting support to be delivered in the venues and spaces that they're familiar with. So what we've done here is we've pulled together the resources from a number of different anchor organisations to deliver something that is within this trusted local setting, and responds to the things that people said were barriers for them. One of them being access to PCs and access to Wi-Fi, because we heard that a lot of people are doing job applications on their phone, may not have regular access to the internet, and it's a real barrier of being able to kind of work through application forms without having that sort of proper, decent IT access. But we also have training delivered by Leeds City College that's happening at the centre on a weekly basis. And we also brought in an employment advisor from the council who's going to have a weekly presence there as well. And then just in terms of kind of legacy and broadening the impact of this work. So we've obviously seen how this has led to kind of development of new initiatives from sort of community settings. But a really significant part of this as well is about how we can influence practice within the anchor organisations, and so look at the way that recruitment happens across the anchor network and how we can help to remove some of the barriers that prevent people from accessing employment in some of these largest employers in the city. So that's going to be a real focus for the network, is understanding what is the current practice around recruitment, and what are some of the ways that we can shift some of that practice in response to the things that we heard from communities. And then finally, and sort of really exciting from my perspective, is that we started this model on a pilot level, working with the Community Anchor Network in 3 parts of the city. But as a result of that, and from them being able to test and develop this approach, the network has since secured funding, quite significant funding, to be able to do this work on a citywide level. So this is now underway at the moment, and we're expecting the findings to come out fairly soon. And this is going to bring us a huge amount of insight to the city about things that are important to people in communities across Leeds. And it won't just focus on employment and skills. It's going to have a very broad focus around things that matter to local residents. So there's a real opportunity there for the Anchor Network and for other partners in the city to respond to those insights. So I think some of it, just sort of in conclusion, some of the main benefits that we've seen from this work is that real strengthening of relationships and building that connection between locally rooted community organisations and large influential anchor organisations in Leeds. And I'll just finish there. Thanks.